When I was living my Christian life on the single line, Greg, I thought sanctification and Christian growth just came through hard work and effort. And the answer to my problem was I wasn't trying hard enough. I would have been one of those people in the crowd thinking this is the moment when Jesus is going to finish talking about the Pharisee as the good example and then turn to say, be more like that. But he doesn't.
Welcome to the Gospel Addict podcast. I'm your host, Bryan. This is a podcast containing content of people whose lives are addicted to the gospel of Jesus. What is the gospel? The gospel is the good news that the everlasting and ever-increasing joy of the never-boring, ever-satisfying Christ is ours freely and eternally by faith in the sin-forgiving death and the hope-giving resurrection of Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Gospel Addict podcast. I'm your host, Bryan. We are back today with my good friend, Jim Reske, and my friend, Jordan Davis. Today, we're going to kind of take a little sidestep. We're going to deal with some potential objections to the content we've been sharing. Let's dive in. But first, I want to give a shout out to those of us. We keep track of where people are listening. We have some new listeners, guys. That very small country called India. We have a presence in India right now. So a shout out to our Indian listeners. We're so glad to have you listening to us.
How many, Greg? How many? 100,000? 200,000? 300,000?
Hold on, let me check.
You were telling us this morning.
7.
7?
We have 7.
That's awesome.
Lucky listeners in India. So Thank you so much for listening. Hey, Jim, welcome back to the show. Help us out. What's the first objection we're going to discuss tonight?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. One is, we've gone through this illustration, this way of understanding the gospel, a really different paradigm for understanding the Christian life. And we talked about some of the S's that summarize the gospel. And we're kind of rolling through those. And I thought, we got to stop for a second because there's already people are going to say, wait, I don't get it. I'm not buying it. Doesn't sound right to me. And if we don't deal with a few of these objections now, I think we're just going to lose people. So I thought maybe in no particular order, we would go through some of the objections I've heard. But even before I do that, there was a thought from our last podcast that I when I went back and listened to it, something I really wanted to mention on that whole concept of substitution, because we spent a good amount of time talking about substitutionary atonement and what that means and why that's important, and how that is what really drives the engine of the Christian life, which is gratitude, right? So when you get the idea that Jesus took my place, that makes you incredibly grateful for the gospel. But I left something out. Do we have time to do it, Greg? Do you mind?
I think it's the perfect time to do it. Yeah, go ahead.
So Jordan, this verse is from Romans 3:26, I think. Do you have that handy?
I do. Romans 3:26. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus.
Yeah, and so this is just a thought that rounds out that concept of substitution. He is just and the justifier. And the image I have for understanding that verse, it's like someone who is the judge on the bench, and you are standing before that judge and you are guilty. And the trial is over and you've been declared guilty and you're not objecting to it. You're not saying it's not true, it's not right. You're saying, you're right. I am guilty. It's true. I did it. And you know what the penalty is for that. So whatever the penalty is for your crime in the country you're listening to, it's life imprisonment. Some countries probably have capital punishment. Whatever that penalty is, you're sitting there saying, it's coming to me. I know it. And much to your surprise and your shock, the judge that you sat before for the trial steps down from the bench and says, I will take the punishment that you deserve. They're the one who's presiding over your trial. They're completely innocent, 100%. They're the one judging you, and yet they step down and take the punishment that you rightly deserve. When I hear that verse, Jordan, when you read it, when you say that he is both he is just and the justifier. He is the judge, the righteous judge, the innocent judge, but yet he's the justifier. He steps down from the bench and says, I'll take your place. And we talked about that shovel story. That was what was so meaningful. We talked about that when the guy steps out of line and says, I did it. I did it. I'll take their place. I'll die so my friends don't have to die. If you're new to the podcast this week, go back and one episode back. And such a story that's been really moving to me in my faith to help me understand the concept of substitution. But thanks, Greg, for the diversion. I just wanted to go back. I just wanted to say it last week and forgot to bring it up.
Thanks for remembering and for sharing that, because that is very important and very powerful to reflect on that. Let's dive into some of the potential objections, Jim. Which one do we want to handle in this podcast?
Let's start with pride, right? So let me tee this up, okay? I'll kind of frame this up. I think the Bible talks about the greatest commandments, and we talks about that. But if you think about what are the greatest sins, a lot of people would say, well, pride is one of the greatest sins. I have a kind of a way I phrase this, to think about this. I don't know if this is a theologian would agree with this, but I would say I think there are two great sins of humankind. One is that nobody but nobody tells me what to do. I'm in control of my life. I call the shots. That keeps people from coming to God. And the other one is that I am not a bad person. I am not a bad person. And I just refuse to admit I'm a bad person. Both of those will keep you from the gospel, but they also keep you from understanding the gospel and really growing in your Christian life, right? Again, to review what we talked about a couple of podcasts ago, is this whole notion of a gospel-driven Christian life, gospel-driven transformation, gospel-driven growth is so different from the way all religions work and from what we were calling the single line paradigm. And not to review the whole thing, but the single line idea is that there's a basic graph or scale where holiness is the vertical axis, or righteousness or goodness, and time is the horizontal axis, and it's just a diagonal 45-degree line. You become a better person over time. And that's the basic paradigm that a lot of people approach their religion to, a lot of Christians approach their Christianity with. And the thing is, when you come back and say, but there's a different way of looking at it, and we talked about it before, so we won't review the whole thing again. But gospel-driven, we say, look, you in your Christian life, the way you grow is you grow in your awareness of your sin. At the same time, you grow in your awareness of his holiness, and you grow in awareness of what Jesus did to fill that gap between his holiness and your sinfulness. And the gospel doesn't start the Christian life. The gospel is the Christian life, right? You grow in that. And as you talk about that kind of gospel-driven life to people, I found a lot of people just, their eyes go wide open. They say, that's it. That's the gospel. And their lives are changed. And other people say, I'm not buying it. I mean, Christians, talking to Christians, and they say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. I try to understand why that is. Like we talked about last week, Greg, right? Like, why don't people take the offer of Christianity to begin with? And I say, but this deeper understanding of the gospel, how the gospel drives a Christian life, why would someone not want that? Why would they say, I don't like those two lines. I like the way it is. Why would that be? And I think it's because there are people who definitely feel like they are winning in that system. We talked before, I think it was 3 podcasts ago, about in our Christian life, people will come by and they'll say, how are you doing in the Christian life? Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. And they're definite, we both know people. There are people who say, I'm pretty consistently a 9. I think at times you and I were reflecting, sometimes I feel like a worm. I feel like I'm a 2. But there are definitely people who feel like I'm an 8 or a 9 pretty consistently.
I've been in those Bible studies where they're asking you to rate yourself like that. I always feel like my default is 7.
Yeah, that's right.
But inwardly, I know what my true number is, and it's way lower usually.
Yeah.
Grown to really dislike that kind of measurement, because it basically, you're just comparing yourself with other human beings. And this is why you're saying that some people, they don't like this, because they don't like the truth that you're sharing, which is, since you called me a theologian the last time I was on.
Mr. Theologian.
So as a theologian speaking here, what we're talking about really is called gospel-driven sanctification.
That's right.
That the gospel not only brings us to Christ, but it's the secret to growing us in Christ. Amen. We never move on from the gospel. We search the depths of the gospel for all of our life from beginning to end. And a lot of people don't get that, because what happens is we come to faith, we receive the gift of grace of salvation through Jesus, but then we kind of go back to our default setting in our hearts, which is is performance and works. And
Right.
that's a very much a pride-based system.
Right.
For example, last night I spoke to a group and I used the illustration of a ladder.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think this ties in well with the one-line illustration. Is religion is like a ladder, and all the different world religions are different types of ladders, different sizes, different shapes, different heights. And they're all trying to do one thing, and that is to get you to go up towards God, to get you closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with the ladder is, and I think this is what we're talking about in this episode, is you can actually feel like you're doing pretty good.
That's right.
You can actually climb up that ladder and feel pretty good about yourself.
See, you and I were sitting in these Bible studies thinking, I can tell people I'm a 7, but actually, that's not bad. That's kind of healthy. That's, as a Christian, we call that the conviction of the Holy Spirit, right? You should have more awareness of your sin. And actually, as we talk about this gospel-driven Christianity, part of the way you grow is a growing awareness of your sin. But that's really different. And what we talked about in that illustration is, as you grow, there's a dotted line in that little drawing that talks about your changed life, but it's dotted for a reason. It's because you're not really focused on your performance. And you get to this where someone says, how you doing? Rate yourself scale to 1. They're trying to get you to focus on your performance. And it's good that you're saying, I have this conviction that I'm not doing that well, because it brings you to repentance. That's probably a healthy thing. But there are definitely people who say, I'll tell you how I'm doing. I'm a 9.5. I'm winning at this game, right? So clearly that's what the Pharisees were doing. And if you go back to the New Testament, there's so many examples of this. But back to your ladder example, because I think that's such a poignant example, Greg, because tell me more about how you finish out that story with that crowd.
The idea is that every religion is kind of like a ladder. And what they have in common is that you're trying to go up the ladder. The problem is the ladder is way too small, infinitely too small.
In your mind.
And there's no ladder. There's no ladder tall enough to get us to God, to where we need to be.
That's right.
And so my kind of devotional thought last night was that, what if God came down? That's exactly what Christmas is all about. The God of the universe left heaven and came down to us, to rescue us, to redeem us, to save us. That's the truth of the gospel. But sometimes, again, we just okay, I received that for my salvation. Yeah. But then we go back to works-driven sanctification.
Right.
So what are some Bible?
But on the latter thing is such a great illustration. I want to stay with it in a second. When you were talking about that, did you talk about Jacob's ladder, that story in the Old Testament? Did you mention that?
I did not. I kept it very simple.
No, the point I want to make the Jacob's ladder thing, because Keller preaches on that sermon. Then Jacob falls asleep in the Old Testament. There's a story. He falls asleep. He has a vision of a ladder that goes up to heaven. And that's where we get the phrase Jacob's ladder. And the angels are going up and down it. And later in the New Testament, Jesus interprets that story and he says, you will see angels. It's when Nathanael's called to be an apostle. He says, you'll see greater things than this. You'll see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So he's kind of equating himself with the bridge between heaven and earth, right? Great imagery. But when Keller preaches on this, he illuminates that. He says, there's a lot of people read that passage in the Old Testament and they interpret the Hebrew as saying he's sleeping there in the desert alone. And the passage says he has a rock for a pillow, which means he has nothing at all. He's kind of like penniless, has nothing, because if he had even a coat, he would wrap it up and have it as a pillow under his head. So he's pitifully lying there in the desert sleeping, sees this ladder, and the Hebrew can be read to say the God of heaven actually walks down the ladder to him. That God comes down the ladder to him. So all the other religions saying, you climb the ladder to me. The God of our religion, our faith says, I will come down and climb down the ladder to you.
That's great. That's powerful.
Yeah, let's talk about this passage in Luke. You want to do that? Because I think that illustrates it pretty well.
Luke chapter 18.
Yeah.
The Pharisees tax collector.
Do you have it?
I love it. Yeah. This is Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, Or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, give a tenth of all I get. But this tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you the truth, that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
I'm just thinking, Greg, if we have some listeners that aren't that familiar with the Bible as New Testament stories, just some background will make this kind of come alive. Because if you understand kind of the context in these two groups of people, it's just really an astonishing story that Jesus would actually tell this story, because the Pharisees were the most righteous people at the time, right? So I think at the time Jesus lived, there were about 4 million Jews living in Palestine, or maybe globally. There were only about 6,000 Pharisees. So they were like the creme de la creme, the best of the best. And they weren't priests, they were laymen. They were ordinary, what we would call them ordinary churchgoers, but they were super dedicated. They said, we hear you, God. We hear what you've been saying. You've been saying we have not kept your rules and your laws, and we will do it. So they were super dedicated. They made up, where there were no rules, they made up rules to follow them. So they felt like, God has been telling us relentlessly, obey me, obey me, obey me. And we want to obey you, God. We want to do the right thing. So they were trying to climb up the ladder. And then generally they were the ones who felt like they were the 9s and the 9.5s, and they were very close, right? The tax collectors in society were hated. If you don't know the history of the story, the Romans who occupied the land at the time used certain people among the Jewish people to collect taxes from everybody else. And so all their Jewish family, friends, colleagues, countrymen hated them. They were considered to be the worst sinners. So Jesus is trying to set up a story by referring to the most opposite ends of this moral spectrum that he could possibly think of. If we were telling a story today, we'd have different examples. We'd say, here's the best possible person you can think of, the most morally righteous, and the worst possible person you can think of. And the setup is, he says, to some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, he told this parable. And the guy who's bragging, the Pharisee, is saying things like, I do these things, I thank you that I'm not like these other people. I give a tenth of everything I have, and I fast twice a week. And it's an interesting little note that there's actually no rule at all to fast twice a week in the Bible. He just made that up. So he's making up little rules for himself, little molehills that he could jump over. Like you said, he made up a little step ladder for himself and climbed up and said, look, I'm 2 steps up. Look at me. And I fast twice a week. He's bragging about it. If you were a listener to the story at the time and you had the single line view of religion, you would hear that, and you'd say, okay, Jesus, where are you going with this? Because this guy is pretty far up the ladder, in anyone's ladder, right? I mean, he's a pretty good person. What are you saying? And I think halfway through the story, the people would have thought Jesus would turn around to them and say, so why can't the rest of you clowns be more like this Pharisee? I mean, he's at least giving it the good college effort, the good college try. He's putting forth the effort. When I was living my Christian life on the single line, Greg, I thought sanctification and Christian growth just came through hard work and effort. And the answer to my problem was I wasn't trying hard enough. I would have been one of those people in the crowd thinking this is the moment when Jesus is going to finish talking about the Pharisee as the good example and then turn to say, be more like that. But he doesn't. He holds up the person at the other end of the spectrum who's not even praying well. All he's saying is, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, just beating his chest. And Jesus says that's the one who's justified. And why? Because that's the one, well, in our little illustration, he was on the diagonal downward line. He had a growing awareness of his own sin and just more in touch with the reality of how sinful he was. And the Pharisee was out of touch with the reality of how sinful he was. Right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think that, and is it true that like we all struggle with this?
Yeah.
At times pride is one of those daily battles that I think every human being struggles with to a certain extent. And when part of the objection is it's not fair.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not fair that this guy the tax collector gets justified before God.
That's
when
right.
he's not even doing anything close to what I'm doing. So
Yeah.
so how do you deal with that?
Greg, I got a great story for that. Maybe as a good friend of mine, he'll recognize this story as soon as I tell it. So maybe I'll tell him it's coming. But we were talking one night, and he's such a great friend. We had these great kind of really esoteric, weird conversations late at night. It's so fun. And known each other for a long time. And one night he said, he's a Christian, a really great believer. And he said, you won't believe it. I said, what? He said, Steve McQueen became a Christian, like right before he died. Now, for anyone of the listeners, especially very international listeners, Steve McQueen was the coolest of the cool actors, I think in the 60s and early 70s. Okay. And he was a race car driver and an actor. They still sell clothing with Steve McQueen as an image because he's so cool that his image still sells products because he's just the height of cool. And so my friend told me that, and I said, that's great. That's such great news. We'll get to hang out with Steve McQueen in heaven for eternity. I can't believe it. I was really happy. He said, no, that's not the point. That's not the point at all. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, that guy lived his whole life, wine, women, and song. I've kept my nose clean my whole life. I haven't done that stuff. And he just waltzes in at the end. That's it. Too easy. It's too easy. And look, he's a dear friend, a dear believer. So it opened up a really engaging conversation, right? Because we had to say, well, why do we think we're in? Right? What is it? Why do we think that we're saved or justified? Because we've kept our noses clean? You're talking in the last podcast, you said you never got drunk or took drugs. You don't have that kind of life background. Me neither, right? Is that why God loves us? Because we've been really good people? And like, no, where we need to place ourselves in this story is the tax collector, right? That awareness of sin to say, God have mercy on me, a sinner, right? I am no better than a Steve McQueen actor. I'm nowhere close to as cool as Steve McQueen. But I mean, the idea that you sit there and say, how can that guy get in? When here I've been good all the time. If the minute I start thinking that way, and this is the sin of pride you're talking about, then I'm starting to slip myself up the ladder again. I'm starting to say, well, I'm not really a zero. I don't really, I'm somewhere on the ladder. And this is what people do. Say even the Pharisees thought they were 9.5s. Maybe the Bible still saying you're a 7, on a scale of 1 to 10. Say you say that you're 7, or you're an 8. And what you're saying is, I've gotten most of the way there on my own in this Christian life. I just need Jesus for that last 3. I need Jesus for that last 4. I need Jesus to fill that gap. And the more righteous you feel like you are, the higher up the scale you feel like you are, the less grateful you are, because you think I'm an 8. All he did is fill up the 2. I'm a 9. All he did is fill up the 1. But I got 9/10 of the way there on my own. And you're just not that grateful. Right.
Boy, that is so true. And I think a lot of people can relate to what you're sharing. So how do you solve this objection? I mean, when somebody is doing well, climbing the ladder or going up the single line, how do you get through to them?
It's look, when we talk about non-Christians, we say part of the reason what has to happen for conversion to happen is you have to be somewhere, somehow aware of sin and that you need for salvation. What we're talking about now is Christians who feel like they're winning on the single line system and don't want to make the shift to the 2-line system. They feel like they're winning on the kind of a works righteousness system and don't want gospel-driven change because they don't want to admit them a sinner. And I think, convincing people of their sin is a tricky business, and most times best left to the Holy Spirit. And a lot of times, I don't know, Greg, you've got more experience in winning souls to Christ than I do, and talking to people and discipling people than I do. I found that a lot of times I just share my own brokenness with people, and I kind of try to be genuine and real and talk about my struggles. That people get there and say, yeah, I do too. And then the Holy Spirit can come in, because it's really this kind of spiritual change we're talking about. It's not like there's some magic formula or 1, 2, 3 step. This is a spiritual endeavor. These are spiritual changes we're talking about in your soul, right? And God's got to do it. And but I think that the one thing Jesus is trying to get across to people, if you look at these passages, is sometimes it's a sudden shift. It's not just a gradual thing. It's jumping off your ladder and stop. You're no longer trusting yourself, and you put your trust in him, right? And you sometimes it's a sudden paradigm shift. Actually, that's what I'm hoping with this book. You say, let's draw it out. And if you see it drawn out, hopefully say, yeah, I'm living life in a single line. And suddenly the penny can drop and it makes sense. And I want gospel-driven change and not, the single line change through my own hard work and effort.
I think your wisdom there is right on. You reminded me of a story, though. When I was in college, I remember this one guy in the same ministry I was involved with, and he used to be so proud of the car he drove, and he would brag about the car that he drove to anyone who would listen to him. Mm-hmm. And the reason he bragged about it is because he drove a Chevette.
That was my second car. I had a Chevette.
He drove a Chevette.
I don't recall bragging about it ever once.
Well, he was bragging because he was taking pride in his humility. It was a classic case of spiritual pride, which I think is, again, what Christians fall into. Sure. Is this kind of spiritual pride. And so he would just love to boast about his humility that he drove a Chevette.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, look, let's make it even a more of a perverse thing or weird thing. Let's say you start to understand the gospel. Let's say the gospel, you make this paradigm shift. You get off a single line to the double line. You start saying, that's it. That's how Christianity really works, right? I'm a lost sinner. I'm saved by grace. And then suddenly you say, I can't believe all those Christians on the single line. They don't get it like I do. They're not as insightful as I am. And you start getting spiritual pride over the gospel itself, which is the weirdest thing ever, right? Because
that's how pride is so. Oh yeah, it's in our DNA,
right? Insidious.
Right?
It just weaves its way in.
It's almost
proud of your humility.
Impossible to cure without Jesus.
Right.
And maybe impossible to cure in this life.
Yeah.
Something we will struggle with day in and day out, and that's why we need to depend on the Holy Spirit. And
that's guidance. Why, but you and I both know real spiritual giants in our lives, right? And they would be the first to say, I have not conquered pride. I'm still struggling with it. But they're just people that aren't focused on themselves. They've got that gift of self-forgetfulness, right? Where they're just focused on Jesus, right? And they're not thinking I'm a worm, I'm terrible. That's still self-focus, right? They're just thinking about themselves less. They're thinking about Jesus all the time.
That's true. One of the most godly men I've ever met is Jerry Bridges. And he's with the Lord now. Mm-hmm. And I had the privilege to getting to know him, having several private dinners with him, and just being his friend. He stayed at my home.
Wow.
And one of the things I learned about him is this very parable that we've been talking about, the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18. It was a daily part of his prayer, as part of his quiet time, his time with the Lord. He daily reflected on this passage, and he intentionally would put himself in the tax collector's shoes.
Wow.
And I think that's how he held pride at bay in his life. And that's always stuck with me for a couple of reasons. One is, that he daily, he was known kind of for the phrase of preach the gospel to yourselves every day. That we need to preach, believers need to preach the gospel to themselves every day. And this was part of how he preached the gospel to himself was this parable had such a deep impact on his life that he would daily reflect on it. And that's stuck with me. I've never forgotten it. And perhaps that's part of, if Christians who maybe are on the single line, if they would just start reflecting and meditating on this passage, maybe they would
make the shift.
make the shift. The Holy Spirit could work. And so let's bring this to a close for this first objection. Is there anything else you want to say related to the objection, or how people can make the shift?
No, I just want to add one thing, because I'm not sure our listening audience, they might not know the name Jerry Bridges, but to hear that story about that guy, I mean, for those of you who don't know, he's a incredible person and a Christian author. So you can find his books. I think they're available online. They're still in print. But I was reading his work when I was in high school, and I saw him speak once. Just such an incredible, godly person. For him to be, what an example. For him to be praying this prayer every day. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Those are great words for us all.
Okay, well, we'll end our episode here. Thanks again for listening to the Gospel Addict podcast. Join us next time. We're going to deal with another objection, and then we're going to go back to the 5 S's. Thanks, Jim. We'll be back soon.
Thanks, Craig.